Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Frank Reese from Acapella Books in Atlanta, and we are very excited to have you on board with us this afternoon for an event that we have been looking very much forward to here at Acapella. We're joined by folks, I think, all around the U.S. and maybe elsewhere. Um, so if you are not an Acapella local customer, welcome. And one thing you would know if you are a local Acapella customer is that there's nothing in the world that excites me more than the subject of Bob Dylan. So when we got contacted by the publicist for an author whose early career started as tour manager for Bob Dylan and the band in the 60s, I signed on right away. And so we were lucky that not only did I sign on, but because of our guest's career that has spanned both music and film and beyond, also signing on is perhaps the most illustrious interviewer we have ever had at an Acapella event, and that is the famed film director Wim Wenders, coming to us today from Germany. And he will be interviewing Jonathan Taplin, whose new book is called The Magic Years, and it chronicles his early career as a roadie or tour manager for Dylan and the band, and into his film career and beyond. And we're really excited about a very interesting conversation between the two of them. One quick couple of noted mentions about housekeeping. You in the audience have an opportunity to ask questions of either Jonathan or Wim. Please do so in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. And at the end of the program, I'll come back on and ask those questions of Jonathan and Wim. Also, I know a lot of you are huge music fans out there. You should know about another program we're doing tomorrow evening. And it's with Kristen Hirsch, the singer, songwriter, and author. And she will be discussing her new book, Seeing Sideways, with Amy Ray of the Indigo Girls. So that's tomorrow evening at 7. All the information is on our website at acapellabooks.com. Also, if you have not purchased your copy yet of Jonathan's book, we do have those available, and our copies will come with a book plate that Jonathan was kind enough to sign for us. So yours will be an autographed copy of The Magic Years. So now I'm going to turn it over to Wim Wenders and Jonathan Taplin.
Thank you. Hey, John, here we are.
Hey, Wim. Good to see you.
Lovely to see you in your living room with all these great photographs behind you. Look, most of these people who are listening to us have just heard the title of the book, or maybe have read it, but they don't know anything about it. I'd love for you to read a little bit from it. Maybe not the end, but maybe the beginning.
Sure. I'll just read a short segment at the beginning of the book, which is kind of where my life in the music business started. Strapped to a Fender Stratocaster electric guitar, Bob Dylan launched into the opening chords of Maggie's Farm almost before the band was ready. The Newport Folk Festival of 1965 was going to close with a commotion. I had just turned 18 and was an apprentice road manager for Dylan's manager. This explosive moment launched me on a lifelong journey, one beyond anything I could have imagined at the time. I was standing in the stage wing, transfixed, 10 feet from the band. Mike Bloomfield, acting like a band leader, brought his Butterfield Blues Band rhythm section, drummer Sammy Lay, and bassist Jerome Arnold into some approximation of sync with Dylan's rhythm. Al Cooper, in a loud polka dot shirt, hunched over the Hammond organ and did his best to fill in the spaces, but it wasn't starting well. I ran out towards the mixing board in front of the stage where Peter Yarrow had commandeered the board. It was worse out front. In his nervousness, Bloomfield kept raising his guitar volume and was now drowning out everything else. The first tune ended on a sour note, and there was only light applause from the audience. I gazed behind me, and a look of shock seemed to be the dominant emotion on the sea of blue work shirts and peasant blouses. The man in the tight pants, orange shirt, and black leather jacket was not their Bob Dylan. What was going on? A crowd of boos filled the air before Bob started his radio hit, Like a Rolling Stone. But by the end, the fans were still booing. Voices from the crowd called for their favorite tunes from the folk era. The band looked nervous, but without a word to the audience, Bob plunged in to It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. The band found their groove, but when the tune ended, the booing got worse. Dylan turned to Bloomfield and said, "Let's split." To the surprise of the other musicians and the road crew, he unplugged his Fender and walked off the stage. Instantly, the crowd went silent. People started yelling at each other in the aisles. "Look what you did. He's gone, asshole." Peter Yarrow bolted from the mixing console and I followed him backstage. Dylan was sitting at the bottom of the stairway leading up to the stage. He was clearly shaken, rubbing his eyes. Peter ran up onto the stage and seized the microphone. "Hey, show Bobby that you loved him. Let's get him back." The audience roared approval. Dylan sat still on the steps. The audience began to clap in rhythm. Dylan refused to budge. Peter appeared at the top of the stairs, pleading with him to return. Johnny Cash wandered out of the artist tent, holding an acoustic guitar. For a minute, he watched the triangular drama of Peter, Bob, and the crowd. He moved over to Bob and handed him the guitar. "Play them a song, son." Bob took the guitar and slowly walked up the 30 steps to the stage. When he appeared in a lone spotlight, holding the acoustic guitar, the cheers from the audience were deafening. He leaned towards the microphone, raising his harmonica holder. "Does anyone have a D harmonica?" Out of the crowd, three of Honer's finest sailed through the air onto the stage. Dylan danced out of the way and, grinning, picked up one and placed it in the holder. He started to strum the guitar. "You must leave now. Take what you need, you think will last. But whatever you wish to keep, you better grab it fast. Yonder stands your orphan with his gun, crying like a fire in the sun. Look out, the saints are coming through. And it's all over now, baby blue." When he finished the song, he rushed through Mr. Tambourine Man and then turned and without a word, walked quickly off the stage. He had said his piece. They did not own him, and like a lover leaving a bad relationship breakup, he would not turn back.
Wow. Wish I would have been there. Were you aware how historic that was?
Yeah, it's one of those strange events that for me was very unique in the sense that the folk music crowd felt that rock and roll was the ultimate sellout. And so the idea that their hero, the protest song singer in the blue work shirt, would now appear like a English rock musician and playing rock and roll was like a sellout. And they kind of felt they owned him. And in a sense, for Bob, I think he resented the booing a lot, but it didn't stop him from continuing to play rock and roll. And that led to him meeting Robbie Robertson and the band and going for the next 2 years around the world playing rock and roll. I think they came to Berlin. And for 2 years, they got booed too. I mean, Bob would play the first half of the set acoustic, and then the band would come on and people would start booing. So it never ended.
How often did you go with him? How many concerts did you attend this way?
Well, I went to work after Newport. I went to work for Albert Grossman for one of his lesser bands, which was called the Jim Kweskin Jug Band. A guy named Jeff Muldar was the singer. Maria Muldar was the other singer. Jim
I love
Kweskin.
Maria. Wow.
Yeah.
You know these people. Oh, you know all these people. Wow.
And And so I was not working for Dylan in 65 and 66, but I did go to maybe 5 or 7 of those concerts. But of course, after I graduated from Princeton in 1969, I went to work full time for the band. And I heard many, many stories from Robbie and Rick and Levon of what it was like being out there in 65 and 66. I mean, Robbie said sometimes people would jump up on stage and try to pull the electric guitar away from Bob. And he said he'd sometimes thought of his Telecaster as a weapon to fight people off.
That's insane. So your relation with the band continued for quite a long time, right?
Yeah. I started working full time in 1969 with the band, and we went. They finished their second album, which has "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down" and "Up on Cripple Creek," and a lot of songs that we all remember very fondly. And then we were booked to do the very first concerts for the band at a place called Winterland in San Francisco that was run by Bill Graham. And so we went up to San Francisco, and we arrived in San Francisco, and we got to the hotel, and Robbie was running like 103 fever and throwing up, and it was just like horrible. So we went off, the rest of the band and myself went off to Winterland to do a sound check with the assumption that Robbie would be okay. And we came back to the hotel, and it was worse. He was like 104 fever. And eventually around 7 o'clock, when the opening act was about to go on at Winterland, Bill Graham says to me and Albert Grossman, who was the manager, said, maybe he's just freaked out and he needs a hypnotist. And I said, what? He said, yeah, I've got a hypnotist who sometimes deals with stage fright. And so we said, we'll try anything. And so about a half hour later, this guy shows up and he puts Robbie into a trance. And he says, your legs are going to feel much stronger. Your stomach will feel as calm as a mountain lake, and your head will feel as cool as an Arctic breeze. And whenever you hear the word grow, these feelings will surge through your body. So we took him out of the trance, and Robbie looked around and said, I feel okay. Maybe I can play. And so Maggie, sorry, Jenny. So we get to the hall. We play the gig. I put the hypnotist right off the side of the stage, and he's right behind Richard Manuel, like 2 feet away from Richard Manuel, and he's like 10 feet away from Robbie. And when the set was over, Robbie said to Richard, wasn't that weird? Like at the end of every song, this guy was yelling "grow" in my ear and yelling. And then Richard said, I never heard a word of it. So somehow the hypnotist had tuned into Robbie's brain, and he got through it. And the next day he was fine.
Unbelievable. Who would have known? Who would have known? So for him, how many years did you lead that rock and roll life, and how did you make the transition to movies? Always wondered when that happened.
So I continued to work with the band. We went to Woodstock, then we went to the Isle of Wight with Bob Dylan and played, in front of 190,000 people there in England.
You were there. Oh, God.
That was in the summer of '69. And then, that concert, the night before, 3 of the Beatles came to visit. It was George, John, and Ringo. And so after that was over, George asked me if I wanted to come visit with him in his house in England, and I did that and struck up a friendship. And I continued to work for the band till the spring of 1971, when George asked me to produce the concert for Bangladesh. And then I did that. And then in early 72, after the band had done Rock of Ages and everything, the band stopped touring, and Dylan didn't want to tour, and George Harrison didn't want to tour, and Eric Clapton, who had been in Bangladesh, was too addicted to tour. And so, I didn't really want to work for Alice Cooper, who was the big touring act of 1972. And so I just thought, well, I'll go out to California. I was so naive, that I didn't realize how hard it was to produce movies. I thought, well, I produced 150 concerts. Why can't I produce a movie? And my thinking was that if something goes wrong in a concert, technically, you're screwed, because there's 10,000 people clapping and wanting the thing to start. If something goes wrong on a movie, well, you can come back the next day and do it again, So
Little did you know.
little did I know. So a guy named Jay Cox, who was a writer for Time Magazine, said, well, when you go to California, look up this kid, Marty Scorsese. He's a film editor, and he edited Woodstock, and he loves rock and roll, and he loves the band especially. So I went and I met Marty, and he had a script he wanted to do called Season of the Witch. And I went and looked at all his student films, and I loved he had a short film called It's Not Just You, Murray, which everyone should look up on YouTube. It's really fun. And I was so naive. I didn't know you weren't supposed to put your own money into movies. I hadn't heard about that thing, OPM, other people's money. So I got a friend of mine, and we each put in
The basic
$250,000.
lecture, though. That's a very basic lecture.
I know. And so we made Mean Streets, and thank God it was a great movie, and we were able to sell it to Warner Brothers. And so then I was in the movie business. And then,
But didn't you do Alice before? Alice doesn't live here anymore?
no, that came after. That was
And
after Mean Streets.
He made it after Mean Streets. Wow.
Yeah.
So he
Yeah.
actually made his first movie with you.
Well, he'd made a movie for Roger Corman called Boxcar Bertha.
Oh,
But
yes.
it's a movie that is not on Marty's CV, because it was more like a Roger Corman movie than a Marty Scorsese movie. So, but I hadn't seen that yet. It hadn't. What?
Did you manage to remain friends over Mean Streets?
We did. And in fact, a year and a half later, we did The Last Waltz together with the band, which is how you and I met.
That's when we met, but I wasn't aware that. I'm now so super impressed that you actually produced his first film together. I mean, how did you find the money to do it?
Well, I'd made some money in the rock and roll business, and I had a little
Did you
money.
put your own money into it?
Yeah. I put 250,000 of my own money into it. I mean, I was so naive, Tim. I didn't know anything about Hollywood. I just thought, well, you make a movie and then it comes out and you'll make
Have
money.
you been declared a saint ever since?
Well, it was the last time I put my own money into movies, but, I mean, Marty and I actually had more of tension after The Last Waltz than
After Mean Street? Yeah.
Mean Streets, because as you may remember, a vicious drug called cocaine came into Hollywood in the mid 70s, and Marty and Robbie and pretty much everybody was indulging a lot. And Levon used to call it philosopher's powder because he thought everyone thought they were a great philosopher once they were on the drug, you know. So it made it kind of hard to control people because they were so sure that they were right, you know, and that came to, as you know, and I talk about it in the book. You know, we came to some tension in that period.
I remember I met the three of you, Robbie, Marty, and you in the mixing studio, and you were philosophizing, so to speak. And you had long discussions about tiny little issues. And I wondered why you would spend so much time on these things. And now I understand it. At the time, I was so naive, I didn't know anything. I just thought you were deeply philosophizing.
No, it was driving me crazy, you know,
Yeah.
because quite honestly, we uh, we sold the last waltz to United Artists for what we thought was a lot of money, right? And then Marty and Robbie managed to come up with ideas of how to spend all that money by literally spending months on a Hollywood mixing stage. And you know what that costs, with maybe 5 or 7 union people working behind
Yes,
the stage and 3 mixers and
I
everything.
remember when I met you, you had been doing this already for weeks and weeks. I remember
Yeah.
that. I was so impressed because in my experience, you mix a movie in 2 or 3 days, and mixing for weeks seemed hilarious, and I really envied you. And I was really very, very impressed because, I mean, what I saw on screen and what I saw as the editor, I didn't know anything about the film, was really blew my mind, and I'm a huge band fan, and all the people in there were gorgeous. And I actually met Robbie and Marty and you. So it was a day that I really remember where I was really awestruck. But that's when we first met.
Yeah. Can I tell you a funny story about that?
Yeah.
So, you know, we edited, it was shot 35 millimeter, which for a documentary was pretty outrageous anyway. But we edited it on an editing table called a chem, which is a fairly small screen, right? And we
It's a,
edited the whole film. And then we decided that we would have a rough cut screening for all the musicians and their managers who had been in the film. So we screen it at the big soundstage, the big screen at MGM, that huge Cary Grant Theater, the largest throw in Hollywood. And we get to Neil Young's song called Helpless, and he starts to sing it. And about a minute into the song, this huge rock of cocaine starts to fall out of his nose and come down onto his lip. And we had never seen it before because we had had it on this little tiny screen. And right in front of me was Neil's manager, Elliot Roberts, and he started shrinking down, and the people were laughing, and it had not the effect we had wanted, right? And so when the movie was over, Elliot said to me, "Well, I guess you got to take Neil out of the movie." And I said, "No, no, no, no. Let me see what I can do." So I went over to Pacific Title, which was an old-fashioned optical effects house, and this
you painted it out.
yeah, this 70-year-old guy puts it on a moviola and with a magnifying glass. And I said, well, this gentleman who he'd never heard of, you know, Young, had an embarrassing thing. He had a booger coming out of his nose. And the guy looked at it, he says, oh boy, that's a beaut. And so he said, well, give me a couple of days, I'll figure out what we can do. I come back, he says, well, we've invented this thing called a traveling booger mat. And we're going to refilm every frame of this, and we'll just move this little black dot over the booger every frame and reshoot it, and it'll just look like the inside of his nose. So it cost about $10,000 to get the rock of cocaine out.
The movie is a masterpiece. I love it.
Yeah,
I've seen it so many times. And has it been restored? Has it been, as you shot it on film, has it been restored properly?
Marty is in the process of doing that right now. And you
Ah,
know how he cares about those things.
yeah, I can't wait to see those. Oh, wow.
So, so Vim, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because, you know, we did Until the End of the World together, which is one of the great joys of my life. But I never was asked you how you came up with the idea in the first place. I mean, you must have written it in 85, 1985, 86, something like that.
No, much earlier.
Oh, really?
I wrote the first draft of it in the well, in Australian summer, but in the winter of 78, when I first traveled to Australia through the back door. I spent months and months in Bali, and then I realized it was so close to Australia, and I took a small plane to Darwin and had no idea where I was, and traveled through Australia for the next 3 months and discovered a whole continent and these amazing people, the Aborigines. And there, locked myself into a motel somewhere and wrote the first draft of it, and then unsuccessfully tried to get it somehow off the ground, and realized it was too early. I had to do other things first because I tried to get it off the ground 3 times over 12 years. And I finally only got it done, partially thanks to you, 12 years later.
So you actually wrote it before you did Wings of Desire and
Oh,
Paris,
yeah.
Texas?
Yes. Those were all in between films that I did in order to sort of beef myself up to be able to do Until the End of the World. One day I wanted to do it, and I soon realized it was as a science fiction film because in 78 it was written for the year 2000. It was far away, and then when we finally did it, it was 1990. It was still 2000 and not so far away anymore, but it was still science fiction, and it was still at the time by far the most expensive independent author's movie
Right.
ever. And you helped me get it done.
So how did the idea that we would become addicted to our screens come into your mind? Because to me, that's one of the most prescient things anyone's ever thought of.
Yeah, that was not exactly in the first draft. It came in later. Uh, and sometimes the little movies you make, these low budget little things, help you a lot with the big ones. And 2 years before we made that film, I made a little film all on my own in Japan, a portrait of this fashion designer Yoji Yamamoto. And I shot that all with electronic equipment. Well, electronic, it was video cameras. And that was the first year when they came out with these tiny little hand monitors, all analog still, of course, nothing was digital. We didn't even know the word digital. And you could have the image in your hand. You can hold it. It was a cute little monitor. And this camera was already separate. The camera was just a little lens. And you could sort of have the image in your hand. And I thought that was such an attractive thing. And I learned that in this little film called Notebook on Cities and Clothes. And I realized how damn attractive it was, and that we would all love to have that. And that was, strangely enough, I felt probably the future of telephones or whatever. It was the future, I thought. Tiny little images that you can control and handheld and run around with. And that became then part of the story, and it became one of the great addictions. The film talks about a lot about addiction and looks at the future of the audiovisual industry in what then was not such a far future anymore, 2000.
Right. You know, I think it's interesting that you said that a documentary helped you um,
Yeah,
figure out how to do a bigger film, because one of the things I've always kind of worried about with big Hollywood filmmakers like Marty is that they wait around sometimes 2 or 3 years between films, waiting for a Hollywood studio to give them a start date. And they just assume their job is to make this feature film. And whereas you never would wait. I mean, if you had some time, you would go with Ry Cooder down to Havana and make Buena Vista Social Club in what, a month?
Yeah, he gave me 4 days to get ready. I prepared myself inside the parameters of 1 week to go, and then we were on a plane to Havana, and then we shot as we got out of the plane. So I always liked, I'm a confessing workaholic. I don't like to wait. And whenever I had a downtime, like in Hammett or some, I made other movies in between. And I love to make small movies, and I love to make documentaries. So, and for some films, I had to wait, and I had to wait a lot. And the longest wait I ever had was for Until the End of the World, 12 years.
Right.
Till we finally get it done, and it almost killed us, if you remember. I mean, we were on the brink of sheer madness after shooting for a year on one movie and around the world, 4 continents, and I don't know how many countries.
I mean, 22 countries we were in,
I don't
something
know.
like that.
Sounds right. It was, I don't know, probably a couple
Yeah.
less, but it was a lot. And we had a tiny crew. And at the end of, in the last country that we sort of got to, which was Australia, we were almost dead. And it felt like the Australian crew that joined us had to hand carry it from one set
Right.
to another.
Right. I
So
know.
we could still shoot, but it was a great adventure. And we got to places where nobody ever made a movie, where nobody ever set foot on. Remember when we did the first trip to the Bungles?
Yeah.
It was a prehistoric landscape that nobody knew about, and it
Right.
was even tourist. It was not a touristy place at all.
No, not at all.
It was unknown. We had to take a Land Rover for 2 days to get there. Anyway, it was a great adventurous time, and I remember those times when we just 2 or 3 people made the first trip there, and you were among us. Boy, we did a lot of miles across Australia for that one.
Yeah.
But that is a chapter in your book.
Yeah. I just want to ask you one other thought, because, you know, the last book I wrote was called Move Fast and Break Things, which was about the big technology companies. And I think you and I are both concerned with the role of technology on culture. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about proliferation of social networks and what it's doing to our society and our democracy.
Well, it has both these undermining effects, and it has both effects that further democracy. Politically, it's a two-sided knife. It cuts both ways. It cuts us into pieces, and it helps us form a better future. It's strange that it does it both and at the same time sometimes. And technology is always such a two-sided weapon. It can help you and it can also destroy you. And right now, I don't know. Right now, everybody is so sick and tired of always seeing other people only on screens, and I realize there's a huge tiredness about being involved only secondhand. But what it does, all of these media, they get us used to a secondhand life.
Right.
And that is my big scare, that a whole generation doesn't make these experiences anymore because they love the secondhand life, and they're so into it and they don't miss anything. And for me, that's heartbreaking. I mean, sometimes I see these young people and they're all the time in front of their, like in Until the End of the World, and in front of their little monitors and stuff, and I feel so sad for the adventures they miss, because their only adventures are now virtuals. And of course they have great adventures, and do fantastic things, and they're capable of amazing, amazing discoveries. But it's all sort of secondhand, I feel, and
Right.
that is a loss. It's a loss of reality, and the whole world is sort of suffering from this loss of reality that goes together now for a number of years with the loss of truth. And the truth decay is one of the scary things brought about by the social media. This, I use the word that I love this. There's a song by T-Bone Burnett called Truth Decay,
Right.
which he wrote 10 years ago, when, or even longer, when nobody knew that was going to happen. It's a real visionary song by T-Bone, the truth decay. And that's what we're living right now. We're living in a truth decay era.
Right. So, one of the things that to me unites you and Marty in terms of filmmakers I work with is your use of music in movies. And quite frankly, the soundtracks of Until the End of the World and Mean Streets are both pretty remarkable. And, many filmmakers just have a composer make a film score, but you've often kind of gone the way Marty has gone, which is like, let's put some songs in it. And what do you think about that?
There is one profession that is almost my biggest enemy. It's the so-called music coordinator. There's people who suggest songs for your film. While that is the biggest pleasure in making a movie, is finding those songs yourself and imagining what sort of music will go with your film. And while you shoot, you listen to a lot of music, and I'm a lot on the road in my movies, and I listen to a lot of music, and I always fancy that music, or some of these groups or songwriters will end up in the film because they have accompanied me already in the preparation and in the shoot. And I always feel that music helps me to tell the story, and the story sometimes is about that music. Or music is also a big storyteller, indirectly sometimes. Directly, it doesn't really work so well, but indirectly it is. And so it's such a great pleasure to get music and images together in the editing room or already in your imagination, that it would never cross my mind to let anybody else do that job. That's the best and privileged job in the whole filmmaking business, is to put the music to a film. So,
I mean, for me, helping you with the Until the End of the World soundtrack was such a pleasure because you were able to call up Bono and say, would you write a song for the movie? It's not like, which song of yours can we license? And you were able to call up T-Bone and would you write a song for this movie? And, that constant willingness of artists to compose something just for your movie was incredible.
do you remember I wrote 18 letters? I didn't make phone calls. I wrote letters. I wrote 18 letters, and we thought maybe half of them will work out if
Right.
we're really lucky. 15 worked out.
Right.
15. Bob declined, and the Rolling Stones and somebody else.
Yeah.
So we had too much music. We had 15 of the most unbelievable songs written for the film, because the idea was that these bands would throw themselves into the future like us and write songs they think they could imagine they would do in 10
Right.
years, which was a beautiful idea. And that's why they got hooked to it, and that's why they came in. But you didn't think, and I didn't think, that we would
No.
get 15 songs.
We were amazed. Totally amazed. So
That's why I
Frank,
had to make such a long movie.
yeah. Hey, Frank, so you want to
Yeah,
come back in?
yeah, I'm back on now. I had a little bit of a technical issue, speaking of the challenges of technology, but I'm back. This has been great. I could listen to you guys talk about movies and music all afternoon if we could, but we do have a few questions from the audience. And Jonathan, the first one for you, you've talked a lot about Until the End of the World. How was it that you got involved in that project?
So I had been an investment banker by a very weird set of circumstances. I had been at Walt Disney. making a movie, and the company came under a corporate raider named Saul Steinberg, tried to take over Walt Disney. He was going to break it up. And so I got some friends in Texas, the Bass brothers, to kind of save the mouse, as we put it. And so they paid me as their investment advisor. And I was, I was young and had a young family. And all of a sudden I'd made more money in 2 weeks than I'd made in 10 years. And they said, would you go to work for our real investment banker? So I went to work for Merrill Lynch, running their media mergers and acquisition group in 1984. And I did that for about 5 years. And near the end, it was a very soulless kind of thing. And I missed the creativity. And Wim was president of the jury at the Cannes Film Festival. Wim, do you remember what year that was?
89.
89. And I came to Cannes, and Wim said, look, I want to make this movie, and I'm really having a hard time raising the money for it. Would you do it? And it was like he was throwing me a lifeline. It was like, this is the way out of being a stupid investment banker, and I can get back to the creative world, and I can help one of the filmmakers I admire most in the world. And by the way, quite honestly, my marriage was kind of falling apart. So it was a little bit like joining the French Foreign Legion, because we were going to go around the world. I mean, we scouted for a year, right? The location scouting alone took a year. So I joined up with Wim's Foreign Legion, and gladly. And it was like joining the United Nations. The production designer was French, the cinematographer was Dutch, the first AD was French, the costumer was Japanese. I mean, it was crazy.
It was, and we were all over the place and really traveled to remote places. And you actually managed to pull it together. I mean,
Yeah.
it was an impossible job, and you handled it. And your experience as a rock and roll road manager and an investment banker came in handy.
Yes. I mean, Frank, I want to tell you that in the original script, the Berlin Wall comes down in the year 2000. So we were in the middle of the Australian desert, and in a town with one television. And we look on the television, here are these guys on top of the Berlin Wall with hammers.
In 1989, yes.
Yeah, it was crazy.
We were in
Whoops.
West Australia, and there was my script being destroyed.
Wim
So we
said,
had to
oh, time
rewrite
for a
that part.
rewrite.
So when you talked about deciding that since you had produced rock tours, you would be able to produce movies, and found out how different it was. You didn't talk about what the biggest differences are in those two areas. How different is the music world from the music world from the film world you got into?
Well, the film world is a little more responsible. Although, I mean, certainly I have had actors who had drug problems, but never on the level of, Keith Richards or Eric Clapton, where you were hanging on your fingernails, hoping they're just going to be able to make it on stage. That was not the problem. So, I mean, in that sense, maybe it's a little easier, but it's still everybody has an ego, and that's the one thing you have to learn as a producer, is that
Not
film
us
is
directors. We directors don't have egos.
I was just about to say, the one thing you have to learn is that film is a director's medium. Those French critics from the late 50s, early 60s were right. It is an auteur deal. And if the director, if you don't yield to the director, you're not going to have a movie.
Wim, as we were guessing ahead of time, the next questions are for you, sir. And they relate to your relationship with Nick Cave and how you came to work with him.
before we went to do Till the End of the World, just the year before, or 2 years before, actually, we shot in 87 and the film came out in 88. Uh, I made a film in my hometown of Berlin after 15 years in America, after making Paris, Texas, and I wanted this film to really be a portrait of the city of Berlin. Among everything else, I was hoping for it. And Berlin was an amazing place. It was still an island city. It was the wall around. It was very adventurous with creative people and artists, especially musicians from all over the world. And also this gang of really crazy Australian musicians. The birthday party that then split up and became the Bad Seeds and Crime and City Solution. And they were so much part of the Berlin scene that I realized I couldn't make a film in Berlin without paying tribute to this gang of Aussies, and especially Nick, who was such a grunge hero in Berlin before the word even was coined. So when I finally started making the film, it was clear Nick had to be in it, and we were able to shoot a beautiful concert. Well, for the film, we made a concert for the film, and Nick appeared in it with two great songs, and it was, when we shot, one of the highlights of the film, and it still is. When we restored the film a couple of years ago, Nick and Bruno Ganz were there, and the audience went wild when the two of them showed up, because they are really at the top of their craft, both of them in the film. And it was such a pleasure to work with Nick Cave, and we've been working together ever since. We also continued, remember John, he wrote a great song, actually it's sort of a title song for Until the End of the World.
Yeah, totally.
Jonathan, I think I'll recommend, in addition to your book, anybody out there who has not read the Rolling Stone interview with you, it's quite good. And one of the areas they question you about is the timing of putting out this book. Like you mentioned, you wrote a previous book about the tech world. What inspired you in this year of all years to look back into your early days and write about the magic years?
Well, obviously, I started writing the book before the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter things, but I did have a sense that in the early 60s, the music that I grew up on of Bob Dylan and others was very both aspirational and very hopeful. In other words, the times they are a-changing. We shall overcome. I have a dream. It was all very empowering, and the notion that the culture and the politics were completely married around the civil rights movement in the early 60s. And so what struck me was that I'm a little worried that the culture today is not that hopeful. And if I think about the post 9/11 television universe in America, I'm not talking about Europe or anywhere else, but in America, you think about it, it's The Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, Succession. What do all these series have in common? They all have an anti-hero who is an incredibly corrupt person who we're supposed to root for. In other words, whether he's a mobster or a meth dealer or a soulless ad man who has no morals. And it seems to me that if the culture constantly puts out this notion that everything is corrupt, like the end of Chinatown, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown, then that begins to seep into the mind of people. And one of the things that is always I've loved about Wim's work is that there is also some sense of hope and almost spiritual uplift. And it's not just Wings of Desire or stuff like that, but it's beyond that. And and that the characters are striving to do the right thing. Whereas much of what I see, both not just on TV, but even if you think about a lot of the music today, it's very dystopian.
Mhm.
And I believe that artists have a real role to play to to show a more utopian world. I mean, I quote at the beginning, the epigraph of the book, two phrases. One from Herbert Marcuse, who says, in its refusal to accept as final the limitations imposed upon freedom and happiness by society, and its refusal to forget what can be, lies the critical function of the artist. And then the second one is from Bruce Springsteen, show a little faith, there's magic in the night. In other words, I think the artist's role is to give people some sense of hope. And if it's always, no, this is just a very corrupt world, and then it's not that weird that we decide that a carnival barker who's just as corrupt as the other people should be our president. And we put him in there for 4 years in the hopes that he's going to change it. And of course, he didn't change it at all.
I don't know if did you read by chance, the book came out a couple of years ago now by the New York Times television critic, The Audience of One, and he very much makes a similar point in that and he traces the history of television up to the point where all of these anti-heroes were our cultural touchstones, and explains that the president you just recently mentioned kind of came of age right alongside of television evolving to that point. It's a brilliant analysis, and I think you're spot on that.
Yeah.
But the music generation you evoke in your book, that was a very politicized and very culturally aware and very utopian time in music business.
Right.
All
Completely.
these songs, all these people that were in Woodstock, I mean, they did have a dream.
Yes.
Well, I think as we get close to the end of this hour, and with that lead in, it seems like a good time to ask you for a little bit on Mr. Dylan. What can you tell us about him back then and these days and in between?
I think Bob is one of those remarkable characters in our cultural history, in the sense that, you know, he constantly reinvents himself. You know, there's some thought that there's two schools of thought about the way artists create, and you know, there's the person who works for decades and decades and then finally finds what they know how to do, which is like Cezanne. And then there's the Picasso, the people who come to it very young and then constantly kind of reinvent it. And I think Bob is like Picasso in the sense that over the years, he's completely kept it fresh. And here he is about to be 80, and he put out an album with a 19-minute song about the JFK assassination. I mean, what a bold thing to do, you know? And quite frankly, I think it's an extraordinary song, you know? And so I'm always amazed, and also that he's a great teacher. There's the talk you can see if you go online that he gave at the Music Cares banquet a few years ago, where he just talks about the history of American songwriting. And it's astonishing the level of knowledge he has about Hoagy Carmichael and people who you wouldn't even think he would have run into. And I saw that in Woodstock in the sense that when what we now know as the basement tapes, that period where Bob and the band were kind of woodshedding, kind of trying to figure out what was the next stage. And Bob Bob taught the band a lot about the American music kind of folk tradition. And out of that came songs like The Wait, and so I think, he's just one of those people who continually finds a way to keep it fresh. And I mean, if you would have asked me in 1969 or 1970, would he still be on the road today? I would have said, you're crazy. But he gets joy out of it.
And my wife and I had just gotten tickets to see him in Atlanta right before the pandemic. And that was is this going to really go on? Or should we cancel those tickets? And we waited and waited. And finally, when we realized we were giving in to the fact that the pandemic was really going to be here for a while, was when we went ahead and said, let's get a refund on those billing tickets. But hopefully it'll come back around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you what a delight it has been to spend part of this Sunday afternoon with the two of you. And in particular, to watch Wim Wenders adjusting his lights is really been good for me. I have spent this whole pandemic trying to figure out how to do lighting for Zoom, and even Wim Wenders is puzzled by it. Huh?
Yeah, I realized my image was getting very, very dark and scrungy because the evening is gone and it's now night outside. So I figured I'd better turn some lights on here, but it's very clumsy.
You look magnificent.
Thank you, Wim. I really appreciate you coming and doing this with me.
I look forward to holding the book in my hands. I only know it electronically. I loved it, and I loved the soundtrack to the book. Wow, that is a remark. That the soundtrack to the book.
There's a Spotify playlist of the book. Everyone
really
should check it
amazing.
out.
Excellent.
Yeah, please do so. It's just as good as the book, and the book is not a little bit less good than that fantastic soundtrack or playlist. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
and thank
Frank.
you out there
Appreciate
for
it.
joining us. And again, if you haven't gotten your copy yet, go to acapellabooks.com. Your copy will be the hardcover with a signed book plate from Jonathan. And I'm going to go check out that soundtrack right now.
The
Thanks.
Spotify playlist.
Yeah.
Got it.
And an Apple Music playlist, because Wim said we have to have it on a platform that actually pays musicians well.
Yeah,
There you
that's what I said, and I was very grateful that you picked up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.